Welcome back, everyone. So in the last lesson, we learned about leveraging the local state values and local state functions that allow us to set those values inside of a context by passing them into the provider and matching our actual context value to have a very similar shape as to what it is that we expect to pass around inside of our application. So what we need to do now is look at a more complex pattern that allows us to actually provide everything we need regarding our cart that we used to handle with Redux into our application, but with the context API. And what's interesting is that this is actually going to greatly resemble the provider that we actually receive from React Redux. Because React Redux under the hood uses the context API in order to pass the store, as well as everything linked to the actual Redux implementation, such as dispatch and map state to props. Everything connects because of this provider by leveraging the context API under the hood. So we are going to end up writing code that actually helps us demystify how it is that we had access to everything related to the Redux store in our application when we wrapped our app inside of this provider that we got from React Redux. So in order for us to actually write this pattern, what we have to do is actually manually write a provider component. And that provider component is going to be the component that has the local state that leverages these actual values that we are going to pass into a context that we consume across our application. And all of those values will be all of the reducer values that we currently hold inside of our cart reducer. So here we're going to store cart items and the hidden, and we might even store the cart items count and the cart total all inside of this new context object. Now, let's actually write the code. So what we're going to do is we are going to create a new folder inside of our source folder called providers, because we might write multiple providers. The first one that we want to write is cart. So make a cart folder inside of this providers and make a cart.provider.jsx. Now it's JSX because it will be a component. And once you've created the cart provider, we're also going to need to move the cart utils file into this folder as well, because we're going to now need to leverage the add item to cart and the remove item to cart functions inside of our new cart provider because we're no longer using Redux. But more on that later. Just copy and paste that file into our new cart folder. Now, inside of our cart provider, let's import in everything we need. So we need to import in React because we're writing a functional component. We need to import in create context. We need to import in use state. And we also need to import in use effect. And I'll explain why we need these in a little bit. So just import them for now from React. And then let's also import in those utility functions that we have in our cart utils. So we'll import an add item to cart and remove item from cart. And these come from our cart utils. And the actual context that we need to instantiate now is going to end up replacing the cart context that we just made in the last lesson. So you can actually just copy this over because this will be the same nomenclature that we're using. So this cart context is going to represent the new one. The only difference is that it's going to actually need more values because we also need to store the cart items now. So cart items is going to be an empty array, and it's going to contain the items that we add to our cart as we've done throughout this course. Now we're going to add the actual functions that allow us to modify these cart items, including add item, which by default will be an empty function, remove item, clear item from cart, as well as one more, which is our cart items count. Now this cart items count is going to be the actual count we see in our cart icon for how many items we have. We used to be able to set it with selectors, but now we can't anymore. but we'll explore how we actually do it with the context API and use effect. Now that we have our context, we actually need to make the cart provider component that we're going to wrap around the actual application, as we see that the React Redux provider does inside of our index.js. So we just want to write a component that is going to wrap the same way. Now, what we're going to call it is cart provider. And this is going to be equal to a functional component that, of course, has children, because all the children are going to be all those components that we're wrapping, which represent our entire application. And what we're going to do is we are going to render our cart context.provider as the actual thing that is wrapping around all the children. And as we know, by doing this, we now have access to all of our cart context inside of our application because we wrap the entire application in the provider value of our cart context. So now that we have this, we need to start actually defining the functionality of these functions inside of our cart context. So we can actually pull out these functions that we had before because we're no longer leveraging the cart context that we had in the last lesson. We're now leveraging our new cart provider component to actually provide the local state and propagation of these values into this context. So with that, we now have our toggle hidden and hidden that we had before on header, but now it's in our cart provider component. We also want access to the cart items. So let's just make a new state that holds cart items and set cart items using our use state where the default value is an empty array. And then we're also going to do the same thing for cart items count and set cart items count, which is equal to use state where the default value is 0. So now that we have our state functions and values, we can actually make our new add item function. So add item is going to be us calling set cart items on the new array of all the cart items that we want to update to. And as we know with our old cart reducer, our cart utils is what we leverage. The add item to cart gives us back a new array of the actual cart items array that we wanted to represent before inside of Redux. So now we just want our cart provider and the cart context to have the new value of that array. So we're going to say set cart items, meaning that we want to set this cart items value on our local state, equal to what we get back from add item to cart, passing in the item that we're trying to get as well as the existing items. So this add item is actually going to be a function that gets the item that we're trying to add as the argument, which we then pass into add item to cart. So add item to cart takes the existing cart items that we currently have and then adds the item into it. So this is very similar to our Redux code, except now we're doing inside of context. So now that we have these functions defined, let's actually just test them out before we start moving on and adding all of the other functions that we're trying to define. Now, inside of this context provider, we want to pass them into the value as an object. So we want to pass in hidden, our toggle hidden function as well. We want to pass cart items, which is equal to the local state of cart items. We want to pass in our new add item, which we just wrote here. And let's just pass cart items count as well because we've already defined it. So now our cart provider is a fully fleshed out component that we can use. So let's export this out as the default value and import it into our index.js. So inside of index.js, we just need to import this new cart provider from providers/cart/cart provider. And then we're going to wrap our entire application in this new provider. Now that we have this new cart provider, in fact, we can even wrap it above our Redux. It doesn't really matter. It's entirely separate things because we're trying to move away from Redux anyways, it doesn't matter the order. We might as well even just wrap ours just to show that we have the most access for everything. It's really insignificant, but it's just a matter of where you want to put it. So I'm just going to put it at the very top level instead. Now that we have access to our cart context inside of our entire application by wrapping it with our cart provider, we can start replacing our old header component that was using the old cart context from the last lesson with the new one that we made inside of our cart provider. So let's just import in the same cart context from providers/cart/cart provider. But remember, cart context is now not the default export, but a regular export. As we see, in fact, we actually need to export this out as well. So it's a good thing to check. So now that we're exporting out cart context, we're importing it in, and we need to now pull the hidden value off of our cart context. So we'll say use context using our new cart context, which gives us back the whole object of everything we're storing on the context. We destructure off the hidden value, which will end up being what we use inside to determine whether or not to hide or show our cart dropdown. Now, of course, because we're not using this cart context provider anymore, we can get rid of this declaration we had before. And now our cart icon still has access to cart context because we've wrapped the entire application in cart context. So let's update cart icon as well. So inside of cart icon component, we need to replace this context with our new provider context. And as we know, it's not a default export, but this actually should still work the exact same way. So with that code, let's see if our code still works. If we toggle, we see that we're still toggling. So awesome, everything is still working. Let's actually see if we can use our cart items as well as the new add item function that we wrote in our context as well. So the first thing we need to do is replace the actual dropdown value in our cart dropdown with our new cart items. So here we're going to import in the use context as well as the actual context that we're trying to use, which is our cart context from our providers/cart/cart provider. We're going to switch this over to our explicit return. And we're also going to remove our use of cart items coming from our map states props because we don't need this anymore. We're no longer using React and Redux. So let's just get rid of this. Make sure that we're not importing what we don't need. And now, as we know, we'll destructure off cart items from what we get back from calling use context from our cart context. So now if we save, we should see an empty cart dropdown. If we refresh, we see that our cart is empty. Awesome. So our cart icon, unfortunately, is still using the actual cart items count we had from our selector, but we can fix that later. What we need to do now is just make sure that when we add items in, we're actually adding them with our new cart context add item function that we wrote. So let's first replace collection item. So in collection item, we currently get add item from our map dispatch. So we don't want to use this anymore. So let's just get rid of this connect. And we're going to leverage our context using use context and our new cart context from providers, cart provider. And lucky for us, we've already got this defined so that we have the actual explicit return. And we're just going to pull off the add item function from use context of our cart context. Let's just remove where we were destructuring before inside of our props. And now we should actually see our ability to add cart items. If we look, we should have 5 items. So our code works exactly how it did before, but now we've converted it over to using cart context. So let's just quickly go over what we did again. What we did was created this new cart provider component that has local state that allows us to update all of the values that we need to store inside of our cart context. So everything that we were storing before inside of a reducer, we're now storing on the local state of a cart provider component. This cart provider component, we then wrap around all of our application, and we provide around it the cart context and the values that we're trying to store in our local state, as well as the functions that will set those values. Now, our entire application has access to the cart context consumer, allowing us to get any of those values and any of those functions that allow us to modify these values in the local state. And now, as a result, our application is able to access everything related to the cart that we are storing in a context, but also mainly storing in the cart provider's local state. The cart context here simply acts as a vehicle that allows us to pass these functions and these values around inside of our application because we're wrapping the entire application around the provider of our context value. So I know it's a lot of terminology, but honestly, the more you look at it, I'm sure it will make sense to you. But now that we've done add item, we can actually write a couple more so we get more practice and get an idea of what it is that we're doing. So let's add remove item and clear item in the next lesson.